So we have a code containing modules on the right and the result on the left, no HTML, just scripts. So I'm going to talk about two modules that we've included here, index.js and index2.js in the sibling and the scripts folder. Now what makes the modules is this type right here. So as we see when we look at this JS file, this JavaScript file here and here, there's nothing really special about those files that mark them as modules. It's the fact they're included this way as a module that cause them to obey module rules. Now those rules are going to be quite different. For example, we've seen that if you include index.js and index2.js in the past, no type module, so they're not loaded as modules. These JS files run as they're encountered by the browser, and they form a global namespace. So if you declare a variable in index.js, it's known in index.2.js. That's the way JavaScript has behaved. And it can get quite complicated because you can include script tags, script files anywhere. And you can also have inline scripts sprinkled around your HTML code as well. So you can see as code gets more and more complex, this type of global system starts to break down. Let's look at index.js and index2.js. Okay, so they're modules, but only because they're loaded that way. So a module is just a JS file. Modules always use strict. Here I use it, but that's on. And we've seen there's several modern ways of using JavaScript that are more secure, more robust, that use strict, and that's on by default in modules. You don't have to declare it. It also can't be turned off. So modules have scope, and that's a huge difference. So this let I here is declared here, and it's also here. So that indicates that these two modules, notice loaded as type module, have their own namespaces. They have their own scope. So this let I equals 10 here is a different variable declaration than when that same variable is declared here. That's a huge step in JavaScript, by the way. This idea that there's no longer a global namespace that incorporates more than one script. Each script has its own namespace, has its own scope. So when we see this alert, it's going to pop up. It's going to say index.js, and it's going to concatenate the 10 here. And we'll run this later. And this also says this. So we'll say index2.js, and we'll see 100 when that runs. Let's get to a more complicated example. Before we do that, I want to have the line 25 noted here. I include the same file again. And we're going to see that pop-up only pops up once. The alert, because once a module is evaluated, it runs the code if it's runnable code in there, but it only runs it once. It doesn't run it every time the module is included. So the modules are being tracked in a tighter fashion. It also means you can include modules in more than one place and get very predictable behavior, even though you're including them more than once. So let's look at importer.js. Notice importer.js is by itself on this list, and we'll include it here. Okay. So at the very top of the file, I have my import statement. So this is the importer. So you import explicitly from modules. And this is the first way, by the way, that JavaScript has ever had to include other JavaScript files. In the past, you only could include scripts within HTML. Now we're pulling it in this code, but we're not pulling in the whole file. We're importing these specific symbols. Say hi is a symbol, A is a symbol, I is a symbol. Here we give it a local alias. So as we're going to see in this file exporter.js, this is exported as I, this symbol, but we import it as M. Then we have say bye, and also a symbol called thanks that we're importing it. So when you have a list of things to import from a single source, then you have a list that's import surrounded by curly braces with your import statements, and you can define aliases within that as well if you don't want the original name. If you're importing everything from a file, you can do import all star, but this is discouraged. It's better to list explicitly what you're using in a file just in general for documentation, and it helps the code readability to be more precise, but also import all defeats module build tools that prune unused code. So when your code is getting ready to ship to actual production, a lot of things are happening to it that are automated. The code gets shrunk down, the code is optimized, and one of the optimizations is to remove unused modules from the code base. Think of using, let's say, the React framework. React framework is fairly large, but it makes really small applications. Why? Because in the end, the unused pieces are stripped out of the code base before it's shipped to the browser. And import star defeats those schemes. So we have another style of import down here. We'll talk about that later as we want to look at how these symbols are exported. But here I'm using them. Here, by the way. Here we have a method. We have a console log A, and we'll see its data type. Console log A is M, that is I is M. And we have the M variable here, and then we have a method call here, say hi, say bye, and then console log with thanks, and we'll see those data types. Let's look at exporter.js. So here, you can export by putting the keyword export in front of your identifier. Here I export a function. Here I export an array. Here I export a number. And here I export a string. This function is not explicitly exported, and this string is not explicitly exported either. It's exported to extend as a list. It's at the end of the file, but it doesn't have to be. The export typically at the end of the file, but it can be anywhere really in the file, but better at the end. And here we export the things that we haven't had the keyword export in front of. So you can export as a list here, and you can also export with an alias. Just like you can import and give it a local name that's different from the exported name, you can export your names differently as well. Here I'm exporting say bye directly, and then I'm exporting the string as defined here as the string called thanks. So remember, Java has a fluid type system, so these exports are real simple. It doesn't matter what type they're exporting. It's just export the symbol. Export the function, export an array, export a number, export a string, export this function and this string later in this list here. And let's remind ourselves of the use here in import.js. The use of the function, the use of, well, let's actually look at the console log here. I'll bring up the console log and I'll hit refresh. We see the alerts we talked about before, index.js 10, index2.js 100, and then hello Ted. That's this call here that's exported from the exporter. By n, that's down here. And in the meanwhile, we logged the array that we exported and the number we exported as I, but we imported as m or aliased as m within this file. And then we haven't gone over say bye yet, and the console log thanks. That comes from the string that we exported, and we say default bozo in there as well. Let's see that. All right, we'll take a look at the rest of these definitions. So in default exporter, we use we're going to use the keyword default here. Okay. Now I can do export, and then I commented it out because you can put the keyword default here. And what that means, this is the default export. It's intended to say this file is going to export one identifier. Kind of like the public class in Java, right? The public class in Java is the one public class that can exist in that file. This is a similar idea, the default export, and it's a great idea because really a file, a module, should only export one symbol publicly. It's just good architecture. So here I use the export list syntax to export this as a default. I generally prefer this export list at the end. I think it documents what's happening better than sprinkling the export and default keywords on the actual symbol declarations. But that's a matter of taste. Now, unfortunately, I analogize this to Java's public class, but unfortunately, it's not as strict as Java on the single export. So you can have a default export and go ahead and have other exports, but it kind of defeats the function of it. It defeats the purpose of the default export. Let's look at how this is imported here. So the syntax of the single import from a file that has a single import just named the identifier right there, right? It's not a list anymore, so we don't have the curly braces go away. It's a singular thing. I have to note that how we import that, since if this file indeed has a single export, there's no ambiguity on the name of it. It's the single export. So we can call it anything here. And that could be a bad idea, because if members of the team are importing this symbol from here and giving it different nicknames in their files, that could be very confusing. You yourself could make that mistake. So I think it's better to keep to the same name as the name that was exported, but the language doesn't require that. For example, I imported it as ZZZ from this, and it worked. I just have to call it ZZZ here when I use the name of it. But a lot is lost there in terms of self-documenting code if you can freely name your default exports. So let's summarize it now. So as we said before, modules are helpful for forming code libraries, and I can think that you can see with module level scope, that's a huge improvement in the way JavaScript is organized. Module level scope. And then the ability to explicitly export and the explicitly import. And then once you include an import module in an HTML file, they can include each other. So there can be a single point of entry for an entire library from the HTML. And the moment we look at React, you're going to see modules. Okay. Let's summarize this. So module summary export. So you can just put the keyword export before any kind of class, function, variable, any JavaScript data type can have the keyword export in front of it. You can also decorate it with default if you have in mind a single export from that file. You can have an export list, typically at the bottom of the file, and there you can export a symbol, and you can also optionally give it an alias. So you can have an entire list here. You can also re-export. We didn't really address this, but if you have in mind, let's say, a mothership module, and underneath it has several child modules that aren't really meant to be imported directly by the top level application, then you can have the mothership module selectively export items from the included modules, and that would be viewed as the exporter of them. So you can re-export modules as well. So on the import side, you can name the import typically at the top of the file, but it can be anywhere. And then you give a list of the symbols that you're including from the single file. More imports from different files, more import lists. And you can also give that symbol a local alias here. Not required, optional brackets. So if you import a default import, it's importing a single thing, then you don't have to give it a list. If you give it a list, though, you have to give it a name. Remember, this name here is anything, because if that's a single default export, it's not an ambiguous name. What's coming from here, the single default export, this name here can be anything. Not exactly a great feature, I don't think. And then you can also, instead of naming your imports, you can import everything. A little bit sloppy though, and it defeats a lot of JavaScript optimization on the deployment end. Also, we didn't cover this in code, but you can import module without importing any code, any symbols from that. Why would you do that? Because then you can run the code from this module by importing it. As you need the code to run, but you don't need any symbols from it. All right, the JavaScript module, we'll see its use immediately when we study React. Thank you.